Seat 2A was the quiet kind of first class. No music, no raised voices, just the soft hiss of the air vents and the clink of a cart moving slowly up the aisle. Outside the window, a ground crew member waved a marshalling wand beneath the wing, and the last of the boarding line shuffled past the open cabin door. Caleb Warren sat by the window in a plain navy hoodie, dark trousers, and sneakers worn soft at the heel. A paperback rested against his knee, the spine cracked from use. Under the seat in front of him sat a small carry-on holding a folded shirt, a phone charger, and a worn leather folio that had belonged to his father, Ellis Warren, a ground crew mechanic who had spent 30 years keeping other people's aircraft in the air before his son ever owned one. Inside the folio, tucked behind his father's handwritten maintenance notes, was a laminated executive credential Caleb rarely carried on ordinary trips. He had used it that morning for an unannounced walkthrough of a regional maintenance facility, the kind of visit he still made quietly, without press releases, because it was the part of the job that had never stopped feeling like the reason he'd started the company. His father had spent 3 decades on the tarmac with grease under his fingernails, teaching a young Caleb the names of every part on a jet bridge before Caleb ever set foot inside a cockpit simulator, and the notebook was the closest thing Caleb had to carrying him along on trips like this one. He had boarded like anyone else. His pass had scanned green at the gate. His identity had already been checked once, cleanly, without incident. The ticket was paid in full. There was no duplicate boarding pass anywhere in the system. No payment flag, no fraud alert, no whisper of a problem. He kept a low public profile by choice. No headshots in the in-flight magazine. No name badge on his jacket. Nothing that would have told Logan Pierce, a gate agent who had transferred to this concourse only 6 weeks earlier, that the man in seat 2A had signed the paperwork that created his job. Then the curtain at the front of the cabin shifted, and Logan stepped through it with his scanner still in hand, walking straight toward 2A. "Sir, I need to ask you about your boarding pass," Logan said. "There's a question with it." Caleb closed the paperback over one finger to hold his place. "There shouldn't be," he said evenly. "It's scanned fine at the gate. Scan it again, I don't mind." He held it out. Logan took it, glanced at it, and did not actually run it through the reader. He looked instead at the hoodie, at the sneakers, at the empty seat 2B beside him, and something in his face had already decided. "I'm going to need a second form of ID," Logan said. Caleb studied him for a moment, then reached into his jacket and produced his driver's license without argument. Logan took it and did not hand it back. 2 rows over, a man in a blazer was waved through with nothing more than a nod. No one asked him for a second card, and no one asked to see the charge on his account or the name on his ticket. The difference sat in the aisle between them, unspoken, the kind of thing that never shows up on any form. Logan's radio clicked, and he stepped away murmuring into it, the license still pinched between 2 fingers. What he said into that radio was brief, a description of the passenger's clothing, and a request for someone with more authority to come handle it. Nothing about a system alert. Nothing about a discrepancy. Just an appearance and a request that someone else make a decision about it. Martin Voss arrived 7 minutes later. He worked concourse security under contract through a firm called Sentrygate Aviation Security, which meant he had the authority to observe, to question, and to call for police assistance, but not the authority to search a passenger's belongings without consent, and not the authority to detain anyone over a fair dispute that had already been resolved by a scanner. He did not know that yet, or did not care. His job was to observe the concourse, flag genuine irregularities, and call in police when something warranted it. A narrow role that had, over time, stretched in his own mind into something closer to unquestioned authority over anyone he decided to stop. He moved down the aisle with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he already understood the situation before he'd seen a single piece of paper. He did not open the boarding system. He carried a tablet clipped to his belt that could have answered every question in seconds, and he never once reached for it. He looked at the hoodie. He looked at the seat number. He looked at Caleb's face. And in that look was the entire shape of the next 20 minutes, already decided. "You fly first class often?" Martin asked. "When I can," Caleb said. "How'd you pay for this seat?" "The ticket's already been verified," Caleb said, keeping his voice level. "My ID is valid, the pass scanned clean." "That should answer the question." "It doesn't answer mine," Martin said. "I want proof you personally paid for it." Martin asked next where Caleb worked, and Caleb, sensing the question had nothing to do with the ticket, said only that his employment had no bearing on his right to sit in a seat he had already paid for. That non-answer became, in Martin's mind, one more thing to be suspicious of. He was not required to explain his career, his income, or his reasons for choosing seat 2A, in order to keep the seat he had already paid for, and some quiet, practical part of him wanted to say so plainly. Caleb understood distantly that he had no real obligation to satisfy any of this. But 2 radios had already crackled behind the curtain, backup was already being requested, and an entire cabin was quietly being taught to see him as the reason for the delay. He unlocked his phone and opened his banking application, aware even as he did it that he was crossing a line no passenger should ever be asked to cross, and that agreeing to it now would not make it right. The screen filled with the record, plain and undeniable: Aurelia Airlines, Caleb Warren. The full amount of the fare, the purchase date, the last 4 digits of the card, the word PAID in small green letters. Martin barely looked at it. "This account could belong to someone else," he said. "The name on the account is the same name on my license," Caleb said, "which you're still holding." "Names can be faked," Martin said. "I can call the bank's fraud line right now, put it on speaker, and let them confirm the charge directly," Caleb offered. Martin waved it off before he'd finished the sentence. Caleb almost asked how a bank account, a government-issued license, and a boarding pass could all be faked in exact agreement with each other. But he understood, watching Martin's eyes move past the evidence without truly landing on it, that the proof itself was no longer the point. It was no longer a search for truth so much as a search for permission. Permission to do what Martin had already decided, somewhere in the first 30 seconds, that he was going to do. Each answer only produced a new reason to keep looking. Martin reached up without asking and pulled Caleb's carry-on down from the overhead bin. "I don't consent to a search," Caleb said quietly, but firmly enough for the row behind him to hear. "Aviation security can search any bag on this aircraft," Martin said, which was not true, and which he said the way people say untrue things, when they expect no one in the room to correct them. The bag had already passed through standard airport screening before boarding. There was no weapons alert, no explosive alert, no baggage mismatch, no captain's request, no warrant, no exception, nothing beyond a contracted supervisor who had already decided what kind of passenger belonged in 2A and was now looking for permission to prove it. He unzipped the bag in the aisle and began removing its contents one at a time, setting each one down like evidence at a trial no one else had agreed to attend. Passengers nearby lowered their phones and magazines to watch, the way people do when they sense something is happening that they will later be asked about. A folded shirt, a charger, the worn leather folio, and inside it, his father's maintenance notebook, its cover soft with age, pages full of handwriting from a man who had died believing his son's airline would one day be something to be proud of. Beneath the notebook, the laminated executive credential, Caleb's photograph, the Aurelia wordmark, the words Founder and Chief Executive Officer, an employee number, a QR verification code, and a printed line for an executive security contact. "Can you verify that?" Caleb asked. "There's a number on the back, too." Martin looked at the photograph. He looked at the title. He did not scan the code. He did not call the number. He set the credential face down on top of the folded shirt, as though placing it out of sight might also place it out of relevance. "This could be fake or stolen," he said, and something in his voice had gone thinner. Quicker, because to believe the card would mean admitting that everything before it had been wrong. Flight attendant Olivia Chen had been watching from the galley. "He's been sitting quietly this whole flight," she said, stepping forward. He hasn't caused any disturbance. She reached for the interphone to call the purser, hoping to get someone with operational authority into the cabin, but Martin cut her off before she could finish dialing. "You want to keep flying this route, or you want to keep talking?" he said. "I can have your schedule looked at." Olivia's hand dropped from the receiver. She had trained for turbulence, for medical emergencies, for every kind of crisis the airline had prepared her for. None of it had told her what to do when the threat came from someone wearing the same kind of badge that was supposed to keep passengers safe. She stepped back and said nothing more, not because she believed Martin, but because she had bills and a job and had seen what happened to people who pushed too hard against men with radios. She told herself, standing there with her hands folded, that she would remember every word of it exactly, even if she couldn't say any of it out loud right now. The captain, still running pre-flight checks in a locked cockpit, had no way of knowing any of this was happening. The purser was 3 rows back, helping an elderly passenger with a medical boarding issue, and never received Olivia's call. 2 airport police officers came through the curtain a few minutes later. Sworn officers, not contractors, with the independent authority Martin lacked. Martin met them with a version of events that had already hardened into something simple: uncooperative passenger, possible false identification, interference with a security matter. Neither officer opened the boarding system to check. Both were sworn officers with the independent duty to form their own basis for any restraint, a duty that existed specifically so that a private contractor's account could never substitute for an officer's own judgment. A duty neither of them exercised in that moment. "What are the actual grounds for removing me?" Caleb asked, his voice quiet, but carrying the particular calm of a man documenting something for later. Martin's answer changed twice within a single breath. Unverified identity, then possible fraud, then failure to comply, as though the accusation were being assembled in real time out of whatever was left standing. Caleb had not raised his voice. He had not left his seat. He had not touched anyone. He raised both hands slowly, palms open, and said, loud enough for the phones already rising along the cabin to catch every word, "I am not resisting. Please record the complete sequence." One of the officers moved him toward the aisle, and at the jet bridge, out of view of most of the cabin, his wrists were bound. He asked, calmly, to be allowed to retrieve his bag first. He was told there wasn't time. Behind him, through the small window in the jet bridge door, he watched the aircraft door close, watched the tug begin to push the plane back from the gate, his father's notebook still sitting open on the floor of the cabin where Martin had left it, its pages catching the cabin light one last time before the door sealed shut. He thought, oddly, not of the credential or the accusations, but of his father's handwriting disappearing down the jet bridge with the rest of the aircraft, out of his reach for reasons that had nothing to do with anything he had done. The incident report Martin filed 20 minutes later would describe Caleb's departure from the aircraft as a voluntary deboarding, a phrase that would later become one of the most closely examined lines in the entire case, because nothing about it was true. He was walked through the terminal and placed on a hard bench against the cold glass wall overlooking the tarmac, his wrists still bound, his bag somewhere over Ohio. The bench was cold through his trousers, and the glass at his back carried a faint vibration every time an engine spun up somewhere beyond the window. A baggage worker, passing with a cart slowed just slightly, met his eyes and gave the smallest possible nod before moving on, because he too had somewhere he was required to be. An officer finally allowed Caleb his phone call. He asked for Sophia Ramirez, Aurelia's chief operating officer by name. "Gate D6, he said. "Flight 286 pushed back with my belongings still on board. I'm in restraints. Security removed me from an Aurelia aircraft. I need every boarding record, every camera, every radio transmission, and every body camera file preserved starting now, and I need that bag located before it's unloaded and rerouted." Sophia arrived 11 minutes later, moving fast but not frantic. The kind of fast that came from years of learning to stay calm in front of chaos while still moving quickly through it. An assistant beside her was already time-stamping notes into a tablet. Because Sophia had learned that verbal instructions without a written record had a way of disappearing when it became convenient for them to disappear, she went to Caleb first before anyone else and looked at his wrists. "Incident number," she said. "Names of every officer here. Who's the supervisor? Where's his property? What's the status of Flight 286? She turned to the senior officer on scene. "Aurelia has no complaint against this passenger. His ticket, his identity, and his payment are confirmed. State your independent legal basis for continuing to restrain him." The officer had none. The restraints came off a moment later, leaving thin red lines across his skin. Martin tried once more. He was uncooperative. The credential looked. Sophia said, cutting him off, "Belongs to Caleb Warren, founder, chief executive officer of this airline." Martin's expression didn't collapse all at once. It slid piece by piece, as the last 20 minutes rearranged themselves behind his eyes into something he could finally see clearly. He thought of the credential lying face down on the folded shirt, still unscanned, and understood that the 90 seconds it would have taken to check it had cost more than he could undo. Caleb didn't smile, and he didn't look at Martin the way a man looks at someone he's about to punish. "This isn't about you failing to recognize me," he said quietly. "You held the answer in your hand and refused to verify it. No passenger should have to own the airline before someone decides the truth is worth checking." The response that followed was not sweeping. Flight 286 was held at the gate rather than allowed to continue. Gate D6 and the jet bridge were secured for evidence purposes, but the rest of the concourse kept operating. Martin and the two officers were pulled from further passenger contact pending review. Every camera file, every radio log, and every phone video offered by nearby passengers was formally requested and preserved before routine deletion cycles could touch them. Ground operations tracked the aircraft, arranged for Caleb's bag to be pulled and secured at the diversion point, and returned it to him 3 days later, his father's notebook slightly creased but intact. Olivia was quietly moved to a different rotation for several weeks, not as punishment but as protection. Caleb made a point of saying, more than once, that he would not be the one deciding what happened to anyone involved. He requested an airport authority review, brought in outside counsel with no history with Aurelia, and asked for an independent civil rights investigator and a full audit of Sentrygate's contract. The investigation moved through the boarding record, which had been clean from the start. The payment history Martin had dismissed without reading, the passenger phone videos, the gate and jet bridge cameras, the radio traffic, including Logan's original message, which contained no reference to any system alert at all, only a description of the passenger's clothing, and a request for someone else to handle it. That single recorded sentence became one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the file, proof that suspicion had preceded verification rather than followed it. Investigators also found that one body camera had gone dark for several minutes during the search and reactivated only after the restraints were already in place, a gap that raised its own separate questions about whether the deactivation had been accidental or deliberate. The gate's boarding logs, cross-checked against Logan's radio timestamp, showed that his call for backup had gone out 90 seconds before he had even finished looking at Caleb's driver's license, proof that the request for authority had preceded any actual attempt to verify anything at all. The investigation confirmed that Caleb had not been disruptive at any point, that the bag search had no lawful basis under any of the roles present that day, and that the phrase voluntary deboarding in Martin's report directly contradicted the recorded footage. It also reopened 9 prior complaints connected to Martin, filed months and years apart by passengers who had never spoken to one another. A black physician using a legitimate upgrade had once been asked to prove his occupation before being allowed to keep his seat. A Latino small business owner with a fully valid ticket had been accused of using a stolen card. A black veteran's military identification had been called fake outright, without a single phone call to confirm it. A teenager flying on his family's loyalty points had been pulled from a premium seat in front of his siblings. Each file had been closed with language that sounded procedural but rarely involved watching the available footage all the way through. Customer misunderstanding, security discretion, insufficient evidence. Investigators found that in most of the 9 cases, no manager had watched the complete footage before signing off on the closure, relying instead on Martin's written summary alone. The audit found the deeper reason underneath that pattern. Sentrygate's service agreement with the airport included a renewal bonus tied to keeping sustained passenger complaints below a fixed quarterly threshold, which meant that every case closed quickly and quietly had, without anyone stating it outright, protected the contract itself. One biased supervisor could hurt individual passengers. An institution that never looked closely enough to notice the pattern had protected the supervisor instead. The consequences that followed were specific rather than sweeping. Martin's contract was terminated. His airport security credential was revoked, pending the outcome of an unlawful detention and false reporting investigation, and he was permanently barred from any passenger-facing security role in the airport system. Logan was formally disciplined, restricted from independent verification duties for a probationary period, and required to complete retraining on the boarding verification system he had never actually used that day. Of the 2 responding officers, the one who had applied the restraints and signed off on Martin's account without independently checking it received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining. The other, who had flagged the voluntary deboarding language as inconsistent with what she'd witnessed and corrected it in her own report before the investigation even began, faced no discipline at all. Not everyone had done the same thing, so not everyone received the same outcome. And Sophia insisted, over the objection of at least one board member who wanted a faster and simpler resolution, that the distinctions be preserved in the final report rather than smoothed over. Aurelia's reforms took longer to write than to describe. Verification would now begin only when a genuine, documented discrepancy existed. A duplicate pass, a payment flag, a mismatched name. Never simply because a passenger's appearance didn't match an employee's expectation. When a real discrepancy did exist, staff would follow a fixed sequence: rescan the pass, check the reservation, confirm payment through the fraud desk directly, document the specific objective discrepancy in writing, and obtain approval from a supervisor who hadn't been part of the initial encounter. No employee would ever again be permitted to ask a passenger to open a banking application, and training now explicitly noted that a passenger's private banking screen was never an appropriate verification tool in the first place. No one would be permitted to question a passenger's occupation or income as a condition of sitting in a seat they'd already paid for. Any bag search would require a specific lawful basis appropriate to whoever was conducting it: contracted security, airline staff, or police. And a passenger's simple refusal to consent could never by itself be treated as interference. Asking for the objective reason behind a detention would be explicitly protected, never logged as non-compliance. Every removal would generate a written incident number automatically, with cameras, radio traffic, and body camera files preserved without requiring a special request. An independent passenger ombudsman's office was created with real authority to access footage directly, reopen old complaints, aggregate patterns across contractors, refer findings for discipline, and publish anonymized results, not simply receive complaints and file them away. The office reported directly to the Airport Authorities Board rather than to Aurelia's own management, a structural choice meant to prevent the same institutional protection that had buried the warning signs about Martin for over a year. Crew members who reported misconduct truthfully were formally protected from retaliation, a policy written in part with Olivia's case still open on the table. Training sessions were rebuilt around Logan's radio message specifically, used as a case study in how a request for authority could precede any actual verification, and how easily an ordinary shift could become the first link in a chain that ended with someone in restraints. Caleb kept his father's notebook on a shelf in his office, the crease from that day still faintly visible along one corner. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that even the person who built the airline could be treated as a stranger to it, and that the only real fix was a system that didn't require anyone to prove they belonged before being treated fairly. He never had it repaired or replaced. Some evenings, alone in his office, he still opened it to the crease, ran a thumb along the edge, and thought about how close it had come to being lost entirely, unloaded quietly at the wrong airport, filed under nothing. The way so many small, ordinary things belonging to ordinary people are lost every day without anyone tracking where they went. Several months later, an elderly black couple boarded a flight in first class using points saved over a decade of anniversaries. A gate employee noticed the casual clothing, the unusual upgrade, and felt the same flicker of suspicion Logan once had. She checked the system. There was no discrepancy. There was no reason to make contact at all. She closed the verification silently and moved to the next passenger, and the couple never knew a question had ever crossed anyone's mind. The most important change hadn't been teaching people to recognize Caleb Warren. It had been building a system where the next unknown passenger never had to be anyone in particular in order to be believed. Should any passenger removal require a single written, independently verifiable discrepancy before physical restraint is ever allowed? Let us know what you think in the comments below.